My life's work in 10 minutes. So, my name is Dr. Gail Dines. I'm an academic who has a Ph.D. in media studies and sociology. I'm also the founder of Culture Reframed. We are a public health group that argues that pornography is the public health crisis of the digital age. I'm also here to say that as adults we have done incredible harm to our children because we have given up our children to the porn industry, which represents a mass dereliction on the part of adults in protecting the well-being of children. The problem is that as we have given up trying to fight for our children with the porn industry, the media of course knows exactly what's going on. In details, I want to give you an example. This is a kind of Cosmopolitan for women, if you want to know what this magazine is. They had an article called How Internet Porn is Changing Teen Sex. And they say, forget awkward fumblings in the back of the bus. Juniors thinking more along the lines of reverse cowgirl anal. Well, if you don't know what that is, then you're not up on the lingo of the porn world. They understand their average reader is between 18 to 22, and they are completely right. They then went on to say, there is an entire generation of young people who think sex ends with a money shot to the face. For those of you who don't know, not the money shot, it is ejaculation on the face. Virtually every single porn movie ends like that, with 3 or more men ejaculating onto the woman's face. I was telling a BBC reporter this. She said to me, no, you're exaggerating. And her 23-year-old assistant turned around and said to her, do you know how many men have come on my face? So I can tell you, if you don't know what's going on, ask anyone between the ages of 15 to 25 how sexuality has changed. They then interviewed a pornographer called Joanna Angel. And she said something very interesting. She said, the girls these days, they just seem to come to the set porn ready. And you know what? That's exactly right. And I am going to argue that our entire culture is basically getting all of our girls porn ready, whether they end up on a porn set or not. Because we are basically in a culture that hypersexualizes our girls from a very young age, forces them into an inauthentic, plasticized, formulaic sexuality that is absolutely from the porn culture and not of their own making. If you think that we are all here today because we're upset about Playboy and pictures of naked women smiling in a cornfield, forget it. What we are talking about is mainstream pornography that is violent, abusive, and is basically based on the torture of women. That is the mainstream pornography that your average 11-year-old will get to within 15 seconds of typing porn into Google. I never thought I would live to say this, but basically, I'm nostalgic for those days. Right? That tells you how bad it's got. Okay? Now, what we don't understand is pornography is not fantasy, it is not fun, it is not creativity. Fantasy happens in the head. Porn happens in the banks of international capital. When asked, why don't people understand pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry with a business plan that's got our children in the crosshairs of their rifle, a pornographer named Andrew Edmond put it succinctly. He said, a lot of people get distracted from the business model by the sex. Pornography, is just as sophisticated and multi-layered as any other marketplace. We operate just like any other Fortune 500 company. What does every Fortune 500 company want? They want early users. Because when you get users, you get them for life. The earlier, the better. Now, if you go into porn, put porn into Google and you will come up with literally thousands and thousands of sites. It looks like an absolute mess out there of producers, distributors. Let me tell you, there is one company that controls most of the porn distribution. It is called MindGeek. It is in Luxembourg with offices in Montreal and the United States of America, which means it is actionable under American law if we should decide to do anything legally. They own 8 of the top websites, the free porn sites. Now what you have is a mature industry here in pornography. You have a dispersed supply chain at the point of production, i.e. production in LA, production in the Ukraine, production in Poland. You have a concentrated distribution through MindGeek. This should keep everybody in mind when we're thinking about what we can do about pornography. Size of the industry, 36% of the internet is porn. Online porn industry makes over $3,000 a second, etc., etc. 1 in 4 search queries is about porn. Porn has basically cannibalized the internet and the internet was made possible very much by porn's money. Porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. And I'm going to run through a bit. Now, we know from peer-reviewed studies, and this is the gold standard of a peer-reviewed study by Anna Bridges and her team, that when they studied 50 of the top-selling, top-watched scenes in porn, 90% of them had some form of sexual, physical, or emotional violence against women. This is the peer-reviewed literature. Those who argue that pornography is not violent are basically lying and are not based on peer-reviewed literature. Now, I want to talk about what porn is. Porn is about making hate to women. Everything you think about making love, all those things, love, connection, intimacy, all of those things are gone in porn. And in its place is everything you associate with hate. Disrespect, dehumanization, debasement, violence. Porn absolutely wipes out any sense of intimacy. In fact, the biggest thing the pornographers absolutely fear is intimacy. You can't have porn and intimacy. And what we're doing is, as basically Detail said, is bringing up a generation of boys on porn culture. Now I'm going to take you through the main act. So I'm going to follow the breadcrumbs of a 12-year-old boy. He puts porn into Google. What do you think he thinks he's going to see? Maybe naked breasts, maybe somebody having sex. What he will be catapulted into is a world of, first of all, the major act you will see is a woman being gagged with a penis till she's virtually vomiting. The penis is so far down the throat that it gets the gag reflex going. She is literally gasping for breath, and as the extra sizzle, he often holds her nose. As he's doing this, he's spitting in her face, calling her slut, whore, and bitch, and there's usually 3 men penetrating her. Standard porn scene. If you want anything else, you have to take about 15 minutes, basically, to look for it. Now, why does the 12-year-old boy stay on there? Okay, so let's look at what they say. Here's a site from Gag Me and Fuck Me. And they say, do you know what we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would like to do. We make them gag till their makeup starts running, etc. Think how clever this is. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. This is how they reel him in. They say to him, you want to be a man? You want initiation to masculinity? This is your initiation. This is your hazing. And then I want you to think of that 12-year-old boy with an erection who didn't think he was going to see violence. Think now that he has a toxic stew in his stomach of anger, resentment, arousal, self-loathing, and disgust. They've basically traumatized him. And you know what? That's a great business plan, because the more traumatized he is by porn, the more he's going back to it. Because with unresolved trauma, you go back to the site at which the trauma happened. This is a brilliant business plan for the pornographers. It is devastating for our culture. It's virtually impossible now in the United States of America to find males who do not use pornography. We are traumatizing our boys. Because if you do not believe that, and you think boys really want to see that porn, then you have to believe there is something wrong with masculinity. And you know what? As a mother, and as a scholar, and as a feminist, I refuse to believe that men are born this way. I absolutely refuse to believe it. I believe men are worth more than the pornographers offer them. The next thing you will see is pounding anal sex. This is where they pound away at the woman till basically her anus virtually drops out of her body. Now, what I want to do is just read to you very quickly what they say. This is an advertisement from Newly. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want, and we're giving it to you. Chicks being ass-spunked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. This is promotional copy. You don't need a Ph.D. in media studies to deconstruct the loading in this. Now I'm going to end by saying, and I've got a lot more to say but I can't, is that we have developed a culture that is perpetrating against our children. We used to have individual perpetrators going after individual children. Now, as Joanna Angel said, our girls are porn ready and our boys are porn ready, and it is the culture of perpetration, and we as adults have stood by. There is an answer. How do you take down this monster, the porn industry, through the Gulliver strategy? There's never one thing that's going to do it. It's multiple. And the thing that we're doing at Culture Reframed is a public health approach. We are building a parents program. a program developed by pediatricians, adolescent psychologists, health specialists, a whole group of credentialed people in the field who are going to basically build a program that is going to teach parents how to talk to their children about porn and how to build resilience and resistance. There is a documentary there called Pornland, which is mine. You can go online. This is my group, Culture Reframed. You can find us. My name is Dr. Gail Dines. Put in my name. It comes up through Google. I will be happy to speak to anybody. And I have to tell you, it is about time we took this culture back from the pornographers. Thank you.
I have been trying to find resources for a 10-year-old girl who's really hooked on violent porn. And I can't get therapists who know how to deal with this. That was followed by a therapist who came up to me when I was doing a training and said, you know, I was raped as a child and I grew to love violent porn. Go back to some of Gail's comments. And then I work now with sex offenders. That's who I do therapy for. My interest in violent porn has never bothered me until I had children. Now I'm really concerned, and I can't make a change. The next call that came in, this was at a conference, was an adult man who spoke all the time about surviving childhood sexual abuse. He was very comfortable, got to a spot where he could talk about that. But he said, you know, the spot thing I can't talk about is the way I coped with that was I got very hooked on porn. And I really didn't pay attention to that until I developed erectile dysfunction. And I see it now. I didn't hear the other arguments. I see that now. I went for a quiet Saturday night at a neighborhood gathering. And a friend had seen my booklet on the impact of pornography on children, youth, and culture and said, you know what, our neighbors are getting a divorce. They're a very religious family, though the wife would like to talk to you. And she said, I tried to be tolerant. I don't believe in divorce. I put up with this for so long, feeling like if I just loved more, it would be okay. But he can't look at me anymore. He's not aroused by me anymore. He's not aroused only to the porn. Individual stories do not make anything a public health issue, but individual stories matter. And when the content changes in the way content has, that was clearly defined for you right now, when the reach changes as it has through the internet, and then we have, as Dr. Dines and many others have argued, the largest unregulated social experiment ever that we are subjecting generations to, we have a public health crisis, and we have to understand what it is people are seeing and how they are being affected and who's profiting. Now, people will often respond to something like this through the criminal justice system. Let's just get tougher and let's look at the policies and the laws there. But we cannot, as my colleague Ernie Allen has often said, we can't arrest or prosecute our way out of this, nor, I would add, can we treat or educate our way out of this. It will take all of that, and it's going to take broad-based social change. Pornography has been defined as a public health issue for over 25 years. You can find professional journals on this. Not a new issue. But in that, one of the things that has been said is, now I have to read my writing here, that the social issues, when something is a social issue, we have to accept that it affects individuals or groups beyond their capacity to correct. That's what we're talking about. This is not something I can just do for myself or my children or in my relationship or family. It's beyond that. And when that happens, responsibility shifts from just what individuals need to do to looking at external causes and holding the industry and broader social forces accountable. Public health is what we do collectively to deal with, this is just, I'm just on board here. I have slides for all of it. Public health is what we do collectively to make the healthy choice the easy choice, to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has looked at the top 10 public health issues, and I'll only mention 5 of them. But these were major problems, and they found with immunizations, I guess I'm not going to go there. With immunizations, this is what happens when you do this instead of that. That the top issues were immunizations, motor vehicle safety, looking at seat belts and car seats and control of infectious diseases. look at the changes that happen. We think about my kids now, if they get in the car, they're concerned if there's not a seatbelt. I never thought about a seatbelt. We changed major social norms. We were concerned about infectious diseases, typhoid. What was the source of the problem? How did we change looking at what was in the water? Fluoride in drinking water and tobacco as a health hazard, a couple of the key issues. This is not only a public health issue, it is a social justice issue. And no mass disorder has ever been brought under control just by treating the affected individual. So primary prevention, I flipped through these now, and you're just going to stay with me and then I'll catch up with myself. Primary prevention means taking action before the onset of a problem and fostering healthy, supportive communities. So the public health model standard is just saying we've got to define the problem, we've got to identify the risk and protective factors, we have to develop programs, and then we have to make sure they're available. Now let's say define the problem. Dr. Dines did a remarkable job of starting that off, but language matters. Around the world, people talk about child sexual abuse images, not child pornography, because we recognize that those images are documentation of sexual abuse. Look at sex trafficking and the difference when we understood that this is victimization, of children. They are victims, they are exploited, they are not delinquents, they are not criminals. When we talk about prostituted women versus prostitutes, it's very different. Think of the difference. Instead of saying sexually explicit materials, if we said sexually exploitive materials. It's not the sex that's the problem, it's the violence. It is not the nudity that's the problem, it's the novelty. We have to name the harm. First age of exposure, a couple studies, because the real essence of this is really going to be the studies you're going to hear about on the brain that make this a public health issue. But this is a recent study that says when young people are exposed before age 11, and a lot of studies are coming up there, that they are going to have more sensation seeking and they will take more risks sexually. That there's a significant link between sexting and pornography use. And a 14 to 21-year-old study, 9% reported some kind of sexually abusive behaviors. And of that 9% that themselves had sexually abusive behaviors, they had higher rates of exposure to pornography. Now we have Clay Olson here from Fight the New Drug and from the Fortified program. His data shows so much what this reflects, and that's a mistype on the 714. That's really between 2014 and 2015 in their Fortified program. Over 16,000 youths applied to this online treatment program. Average age 11.9. Of the applicants, 9% viewed pornography by age 8, 10 by 24% by age 10, 77% by age 13, 85% were males, 15% are females. Only 10% of those paid for it. They were hooked by the free pornography. There's a secondhand effect of pornography, and that is even if I protect my children, they're going to be affected by the behaviors, the attitudes, and expectations of others. There's a blurring of lines between what's legal and not, and environment matters. And I just want to go through this because the reality is we live in a sexually toxic, pornified culture. Our children go from Dr. Seuss to porn, and toxic decisions make sense in a toxic environment. And here's an example. Look at these onesies for babies. Onesies for babies. When we're putting this on our baby boys that say mother sucker, playground pimp, I'm a product of 50 Shades of Grey, who's profiting? This is sexual abuse when we groom children this way. It's a compliant victimization that teaches our girls how to be product and our boys to be demand, and it is a sexual neglect when we don't respond. People say the cat's out of the bag. I would say, yeah, but we can change it. Think about the changes that happen with tobacco. When we recognize the harm of a product and we hold accountable via policy, via education, we can change norms, we can change practices, we can take on a product that some people profit from at the health and the harm to all of us. Our children need us Our families need us, and we can make a difference.
For too long, pornography has been viewed as simply a First Amendment issue, a First Amendment right, really, with little consideration given to the rights of those who might be harmed in its production. The time has come to consider pornography from the perspective of public health. As a medical doctor, I would like to address two considerations regarding pornography that have been largely ignored in the past and which now warrant our attention. First, pornography is a biologically addictive medium which alters brain reward and motivation systems in a negative way. In the past, addiction was defined only from the perspective of the behavioral sciences, whereas the definition of addiction is now increasingly informed by the biological sciences as well. For instance, drug addiction has long been associated with shrinkage in key brain reward areas. It's also been associated with negative metabolic or functional changes in how the reward system works. Based on an evolving understanding of how the chemistry of the brain changes with both drug addiction and with behavioral addictions, such as to food, sex, and gambling, Dr. Clark Watson and I predicted in a paper published in the journal Surgical Neurology International in 2011 that pornography would be associated with shrinkage in the brain's key reward areas, and that it would also demonstrate similar metabolic changes in these same reward areas, both of which are seen in drug addiction. We recommended a public health approach at that time, as Cordelia said, similar to what has been done with infectious disease. This hypothesis was based on our understanding that similar DNA mechanisms are involved with craving states associated both with drug addiction and with natural rewards as well. I was involved in a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2011, which demonstrated that one of the most basic natural drives, that is the craving for salt, is driven by the same DNA transcripts which drive drug craving. Our paper summarized that addiction usurps these natural craving pathways. In an article about this paper, National Geographic used the word hijacked in describing how addiction changes the perspective of the brain's reward mechanisms. In the last year, our prediction that these changes would be associated with pornography addiction have been verified. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Psychiatry, out of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, demonstrated that pornography is associated both with shrinkage in the brain reward center, as well as with impairment and connectivity with the frontal judgment and control areas. This shrinkage is more pronounced in the heavier users. While this was a correlational rather than a longitudinal study, causation is certainly supported based on other prospective data. The fact that shrinkage was more pronounced in heavier pornography users versus those with less hours viewed per week is certainly supportive of causation when considering what we know about how our brains change with learning. For instance, until the mid-90s, we all thought that learning did not change the physical structure of the brain. However, since 1995, a study published in the journal Science demonstrated that part of the brain that controls hand function is enlarged in violin players, and that this effect is increased the earlier they begin to play. Other learning modalities have also been found to cause physical changes, structural changes in the brain, including cab drivers, jugglers. A study published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2006 showed that medical students' brains show enlargement in key learning areas when scanned before and after a 3-month period of intensive studying. Zatori and his associates in the journal Nature Neuroscience in 2012 said the brain is the source of behavior, but in turn is modified by the behaviors it produces. Learning sculpts brain structure. Kaur Malinka, in a paper published in Nature Neuroscience Reviews, looking at how brain cell connections are affected by addiction, said addiction represents a pathological yet powerful form of learning and memory. Given what we now know about how learning changes the brain, would we expect to see physical changes in the brain in addiction as well? We would, and we do. Virtually every study looking at addiction has shown shrinkage and abnormalities in the reward areas, and this includes drugs such as cocaine, methamphetamine, and opiates, and also behavioral addictions such as to food, sex, the internet, and as we have discussed, pornography. When we look at the Kuhn study showing shrinkage with pornography and interpret the results in the context of other studies, we would have to come to the ludicrous conclusion that if pornography does not cause at least some of the shrinkage seen, it is the only learning activity to which the brain is immune. Incentive sensitization is where the brain's reward center is hypersensitive to cues associated with addiction. For instance, when a person with a cocaine addiction is shown a picture of a line of cocaine, their brain lights up with fMRI. This study, published in PLOS ONE by Dr. Voon and her colleagues out of Cambridge University last year, was actually published in 2 papers, showed that pornography also shows a similar incentive sensitization, very similar to cocaine. In fact, she summarized that this is actually supportive of an addictive model. And there's, of course, more work to be done from the fMRI standpoint, but it was certainly supportive of the model. She also found in this paper that a wanting-liking split was supported with pornography addiction, which is a hallmark of all addiction. They summarized, these studies together provide support for an incentive motivation theory of addiction underlying the aberrant response towards sexual cues and compulsive sexual behaviors. Pornography, particularly as presented by the internet, is a supernormal stimulus. Nicholas Tinbergen, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, coined the term. He did an experiment with birds where they chose to roost brightly painted plaster eggs over the real ones. And more pertinently, he did an experiment with butterflies where the males found the females based on the shape and color of their wings. He painted artificial female wings bigger and brighter than real ones, put the males with both the real females and the artificial females, and the males preferentially mated with the artificial females. Sounds familiar, and sounds a lot like today.
So I want to just talk a little bit about harm to children. There are a lot of ways in which adult pornography is harmful to children. But a lot of the ways, in the first maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks around this circle, have to do with adult behavior. So when you have an adult, for example, who is looking at pornography, some of those adults are potential sex offenders, and they're looking at pornography as a plan for action to abuse children. Some are looking at pornography to make sexually explicit materials in order to network with children. These are cyber enticers. Adults who use adult pornography in order to entice youth to self-produce, usually setting a child up for potential sextortion, and using images as blackmail. Sometimes adults who show youth adult pornography in order to educate them and to seduce them. So let's stop right there for a minute, because I'll show that to you again in a second. Let's talk a little bit about the adult who is going to entice youth to self-produce. I want to tell you about a case that I worked in. I've worked in a lot of child sexual exploitation cases, but I want to talk to you about this one, the made-to-order case. This is a case of street children who were lured in Mexico. They were lured by offenders who were producers of child abuse images. They brought these children into hotels, let them swim in the swimming pools, gave them food. These were street children who otherwise wouldn't have had such. And then they showed them adult pornography. That's an interesting thing to do with street children. Most of these children were between the ages of 8 and 10. They were almost all boys. They were groomed to touch their genitals, to masturbate, and then eventually to have sexual contact with each other. Why? Why was somebody doing this? They did this so that they could videotape these children and make commercial child abuse image or child pornography videotapes to sell over the internet. That's how they did it, the made-to-order process. In the beginning, when we first started having child abuse images, and that's my term for child pornography, when they were first available on the internet, they were as blatant as child porn sold here, a very common thing. In 2004, I was on an expert working group, of which there were only 2 Americans, entitled Children and Young Persons with Abusive and Violent Experiences in Cyberspace, sponsored by the Council of the Baltic Seas. And this is a group of people that got together. All of us had experience of children whose images were on the internet, and we were starting to compare notes. And what is it about these children? Why is it they don't tell? What is it about them that makes them keep it a secret when they've been exploited on the internet? Well, one of the researchers, Tim Palmer from the UK, wrote in a document called Just a Click, children don't tell when images have been made of them, because these images made it look as if that they just let it happen. They didn't fight it off, so to speak. The degree of guilt, self-blame, and shame that these children have experienced is a barrier to their disclosure. And we really see that here in the United States and in other countries as well. If a child has been abused by an adult and images have been made of that abuse, these children will almost invariably not tell you. I don't care how great a forensic interviewer you may be. Many, many child advocacy centers have seen these children absolutely deny that anything has happened to them. The offenders can convince children, in fact, that the making of these images was the child's idea, therefore transferring the guilt and self-blame onto the child. So let's look at another type of harm that we can see. Teenagers who view adult pornography images and then become disinhibited looking for other children in order to sexually abuse. Youth sex offenders who have accessed internet pornography and then become, in fact, their own offenders. Children learn what they see. Here's a case out of Nebraska. These are two 13-year-old boys who are videotaping themselves sexually assaulting a 5-year-old. First of all, sexually assaulting a 5-year-old is bad enough. But why did they videotape themselves? Because that's what you see on the internet. You see memorialization of abuse so commonly. Another way in which we see children harmed is when adults who view adult pornography use it as a plan of action for child sexual abuse. So an offender, I'm going to tell you of a different case that I worked in. This is not in the United States. An offender became known as he was trading images of child torture that he had made of his own 2 young daughters. He was a working man who didn't stand out in a crowd, but he was discovered by having thousands of images over several years of abusing his children, his 2 daughters, including bondage, restraints, imprisonment, and other acts of torture. I had to review most of the images, if not all of the images that he made. But what was very interesting to me was when that country transferred his whole database for me to review, and this gentleman had gigabytes of adult torture pornography. That's where you can see individuals who are looking at adult pornography as a plan of action. After they kind of get fed up with adult pornography, not only do they think about having child abuse images, but they are more likely, in fact, to produce their own images. And then I want to bring up the type of adult who abuse adult pornography and then make sexually explicit materials to network with other like-minded people. One of the things that we've seen in our country and in other countries is that when individuals are collecting images, they like to network and talk to each other about it so that they don't appear to be so abnormal, so aberrant, as I know Ernie Allen has said to me before in the past. We're not really that abnormal. We're all just alike. There's some unpredictable desires. It's unclear as to what components of online images convince a viewer of what they're seeing is normal, desired, or even it causes the viewer to have some degree of elation associated with the power of a sexual image. Because we know that adult pornography is very often about power and control. The messages that are depicted in these images are often about power and control. We wonder, are there chemicals in the brains that are being secreted besides dopamine and serotonin? And is the developing brain more vulnerable to these memories? We think, yes, that's the case. And are the mirror neurons that I've spoken about, which are scattered throughout the lobes of the brain, convincing the viewer that what you see is what you get? I just was in a conference last week in London entitled From Discovery to Recovery, and it was all about the issue of abusive images, not adult pornography, but abusive images on the internet and how that changes a child's life. It doesn't just change their life from the perspective of being a child sexual abuse victim, but it changes their life as an adverse childhood experience. And when we think about the public health model, childhood adversities, we know, will interrupt or disrupt a child's neurodevelopment. They begin to develop problems in schools, distractibility, perhaps have PTSD, which then leads them to have social and cognitive and emotional dysfunction with peers. When that happens and they start to become not so functional in their workplace, that is school, they will develop high-risk behaviors such as drinking, smoking, sometimes self-injurious behaviors like cutting. And when that happens, then they begin to have more problems with respect to other diseases, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and in essence, an earlier death. This adverse childhood experiences model has been accepted around the world. And it is most assuredly the case when we have children who are affected by adult pornography, then go on to develop aberrant and sometimes criminal behaviors, or when they themselves have been victims with respect to the issue of child abuse images. And so for recovery, we have to really think about prevention. We have a national coalition on the prevention of sexual exploitation, and in this particular model, there are 6 pillars of things that need to be done. One of the ones that I'd like to mention of the 6 are making sure that youth-serving organizations, all youth-serving organizations, consider how to protect children from the very beginning. I did a consultation for a large youth serving organization who talked about having summer camps. And in the summer camps, kids were allowed to have their cell phones in their cabins when they slept overnight. And I said to them, well, hang on for a second. Perhaps that's not a good idea, because we are so unfortunately in that era of making images of individuals, bullying kids, someone who's sleeping, for example. This is not what we want to do. And so I want to end by saying, the question is not so much is what you see, what you get. The question really is what you see, is that what gets you? I want to thank you very much. And I want to encourage you to know that we are about the business of trying to spread the word of all of the issues that are related to online images. And in fact, we have a documentary that's coming out in the end of August regarding the presence of online images of children on the internet and that victim impact. Thank you very much.
Pornography is an act of prostitution. A survivor of prostitution explained, pornography is prostitution that's legalized as long as you get to take pictures. Pornography also documents and facilitates trafficking. Please don't mystify the sex industry. Don't assume it's vastly different from other kinds of exploitation and human cruelty. The real lives of those who are trafficked or prostituted or made into pornography are often indistinguishable from the real lives of victims of rape, incest, and domestic violence. The main difference is money. I forgot to turn this timer on. Is this how you turn it on? Okay. A minute. Okay. The main difference between these kinds of sexual assault, sexual violence, physical violence, and acts that happen in the sex industry is money. Profits turn the sexual assault of children, rape, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, humiliation, sexual harassment, and pictures taken of those things into a business enterprise. Like other global businesses, there are domestic and international sectors, marketing sectors, a range of physical locations out of which they operate, and there are lots of different owners and managers, and the sex industry is constantly expanding as technology, law, and public opinion permit. In the real world, from the perspective of the person in the sex trade, pornography, prostitution, and trafficking are pretty much the same. More than 80% of the time, women in the sex industry are under pimp control. That is trafficking. Pornography meets the legal definition of trafficking if the pornographer recruits, entices, or obtains women for the purpose of photographing live commercial sex acts. Women are coerced into pornography by deception, threats, and violence. A survivor of pornography and prostitution explained that she'd been pressured to do more extreme sex acts on film, just the way women in prostitution are pressured to perform more extreme sex acts with sex buyers. Pornographers are specialty pimps who use pornography to advertise prostitution and to traffic women. Backpage, which advertises and sells pornography, is owned by a Dutch company. And last week, if you notice, the Massachusetts Attorney General said most of the human trafficking cases that our office has prosecuted involve advertisements from Backpage. It's all connected. Here's an example of some of the links between pornography, prostitution, and trafficking. Glenn Marcus ran a torture pornography website. A woman was psychologically coerced by him to permit pornography of her to be sold on another website called slavespace.com. She brought charges against Marcus, who was her pimp, pornographer, trafficker, and torturer, and at one point he stuffed a gag in her mouth, sewed her mouth shut, and hung her on a wall. Her attorneys used the following definition: sex trafficking is coercing or selling a person into a situation of sexual exploitation, such as prostitution or pornography. On March 5th, 2007, pornographer Marcus was convicted of sex trafficking. This legal decision reflects a deepening understanding of the ways in which pornography, prostitution, and trafficking are the same for the person who's being sexually coerced and exploited for profit. Another example, the convergence of different arms of the sex industry can be seen in a law enforcement action in Las Vegas. A sex business that looked like a bunch of offices in a strip mall blended pornography production, trafficking, escort, and webcam prostitution. On a webcam site, you probably know, the sex buyer pays to chat with women who prostitute on streaming video, performing in real time what the masturbating sex buyer pays them to do. So in this case, the pimp pornographer rented 6 offices that functioned as internet pornography business, cyber prostitution via webcam, and a place where women were pimped out to hotels and a brothel. And of course, in Las Vegas, all prostitution is illegal. So the women who were pimped from this agency into Las Vegas hotels were trafficked. The same oppressive experiences channeling women into pornography, prostitution, and trafficking send them, and the same experiences channel them into all 3 aspects of the sex industry: childhood abuse and neglect, a lack of quality education and job training opportunities, culturally mainstream misogyny, racism, and poverty. All of these coerce women into the sex trade. We now have women turning tricks for a tank of gas or cheeseburgers. The same kinds of violence against women are perpetrated in pornography, prostitution, and trafficking. Women face a weekly likelihood of rape. A Canadian woman said, "What's rape for others is normal for us." A woman at a legal Nevada brothel said legal prostitution was like you sign a contract to be raped. And many of the pimps who run the legal brothels are also taking pornography of the women, sometimes without their knowledge or permission. The emotional consequences of prostitution and pornography and trafficking are also pretty much the same in widely varying cultures, whether it's legal or illegal, inside or outside, high class or low class. Symptoms of emotional distress among those in sex businesses are off the charts: depression, suicidality, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, eating disorders, substance abuse. 2/3 of women, men, and transgenders in prostitution in 9 countries met criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. This level of emotional distress, 2/3 of everybody engaged in a certain activity, is the same as the most emotionally traumatized people ever studied by psychologists. That is, rape victims, battered women seeking shelter, combat vets, and survivors of state-sponsored torture. Why do industry advocates de-link pornography, prostitution, and trafficking? The answer is because it increases profits. Disconnecting trafficking from prostitution and pornography normalizes most of the sex industry. Here's how the delinking works. Every time an adjective is put in front of the word prostitution, pornography, or trafficking, it carves out a group of human beings who we allow to be sold for sex. Forced versus voluntary trafficking. It's assumed some people volunteer to traffic themselves. Child versus adult pornography. It's assumed to be normal and mainstreamed to make pornography of adults. legal versus illegal prostitution. It's assumed that legal prostitution reduces harm, and thus it's acceptable. Now I want to ask you, did we do this with slavery? Did abolitionists focus on saving child slaves, leaving their parents behind? No, we didn't. Do we do this with domestic violence? Do advocates focus only on the most extreme cases and leave behind the woman who only has bruises but no broken bones? No, we don't. Yes, pornography is a public health crisis, and we have to link all of the arms of this hydra-headed industry and understand that individuals who are pornographized and trafficked and prostituted are harmed, and the sex industry also harms the rest of us. Sex business entrepreneurs count on our tolerance for social injustice. And your presence here in this room tells me that they made a mistake. Thank you.
I want to say a few things in starting about children and young adults. The main job of parents is to teach their children how to become adults. We know that children do what they see, and we know that they do what they see others get rewarded for, and we know they get good at whatever they practice. Is this not going anywhere? There we go, okay. So first the children watch their parents, and then they watch their friends, and then they watch the world, and the media delivers this world to them. But how do children and young adults learn about sexuality? Parents are often uncomfortable talking to them about sex. Sex education in schools do not cover all the aspects, especially the moral and the psychological aspects, and for good reasons. Children rarely see the behavior in real life. But someone is feeding them information about sexuality. Who and what? Internet pornography is what is feeding them. But what information is it feeding them? It's telling them this: there's no such thing as too much sex. There's no sexual behavior that's hurtful, toxic, or traumatizing. Sex is not about intimacy, caring, love, or respect. Sex is not about marriage or having children. Sex is casual, it's recreational, it's adversarial, and it's non-intimate. And in fact, you don't even need to know your partner, because sex with strangers is the best and most intense kinds of sex. And you can see the consequences of that in the hookup culture on our college campuses. Of course, all these things are not true. That's because the internet pornography is actually giving them sexual junk food. No wonder that the psychologists call internet pornography the new crack cocaine. If you eat the sexual junk food, you may become sexually obese. But what moves these sexual obesity attitudes into sexual obesity behaviors? Permission-giving beliefs. Now, permission-giving beliefs are beliefs that say, what I'm doing is normal, and it really doesn't hurt anybody, and everybody's doing it, so therefore I don't need to change my behavior, I need to get on the bandwagon and join into this behavior. And internet pornography is spreading these permission-giving beliefs. It's telling our children that it's normal, that it doesn't hurt anybody, and everybody is doing it. Oh gosh, I went too fast. Okay, here we go. Physical obesity is causing a dramatic increase in catastrophic illnesses such as diabetes and threatening to shorten the lifespan of children and young adults. But sexual obesity is causing catastrophic outcomes as well. From this point on, I'm going to be talking about the outcomes of research, and I can't summarize all the studies, but I'll get through maybe about 50 findings. Here we go. Hold on. Okay, so this is what we find from the research. Males who use pornography think that women enjoy rape. They think she got what she wanted when she was raped, that women make false accusations of rape, that they're more accepting of the rape myth, they're more accepting of violence against women, and they think rapists deserve less time in prison. Is it possible that looking at internet pornography makes them think that rape is not such a heinous crime? What's the consequence of that? They use more sexual terms to describe women, they see women as sex objects, and they have reduced support for the women's liberation movement. What's the consequence of that? They rate their partners as less attractive, they're less satisfied with their partner's sexual performance, they have greater desire for sex without any emotional intimacy, and they have more sexually callous beliefs. Greater acceptance of sex outside of marriage for married individuals. There's an attitude we were hoping for. Let's all cheat. And they're less child-centered during marriage and less desiring of female children. More willing to have sex with 13 and 14-year-olds, more willing to have sex and more attracted to children, and less likely to think that pornography needs to be restricted from children. In my own research, I found that the increasing use of pornography is related to higher psychopath scores. Are internet pornography websites teaching our boys to think and act like psychopaths? What's the consequence of that? Now I want to look at behavior, because those were all attitude changes. In my own clinical practice, I find that males who use pornography have erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, retarded ejaculation, and in one study, 58% of the male pornography users, average age 25, had erectile dysfunction with women, but not with pornography. They can perform with pixels, but not with people. What's the consequence of that? We see that they have teen brain, which is more activity in the impulsive parts of their brain than the rational and executive parts of their brain. They have cocaine brain, which is equal liking but much more desire for pornography, less gray matter, less brain sensitivity to sexual stimuli, less brain connectivity. Did we want this substance that changed their brain? They're more likely to have affairs when they're married. So here's the behavioral consequence of that attitude of cheating is okay. Now they're behaving that way. And they're more likely to go to prostitutes, adding an illegal aspect to their sexual acting out. In my own research, I found that 25% of the young males said that they'd either already gone to a prostitute or plan to in the future, and the more pornography they used, the more likely they were to say that. I also found that the males who use pornography are more likely to go to strip clubs, and that those who go to strip clubs are more likely to engage in non-consenting sex. They use more violent sexual fantasies to get themselves aroused. They're more likely to sexually harass women. They're more likely to sexually abuse partners whom they have battered. They engage in stranger rape, date rape, marital rape. They verbally coerce sex, physically coerce sex, use drugs and alcohol to coerce sex. In my own research, I found that the earlier the male children were exposed to pornography, the more likely they were to engage in non-consensual sex as young adults. There are in fact 3 factors that are identified that are connected with sexual violence. The first is hostility toward women. The second is belief that sex is a casual, non-intimate, recreational, adversarial behavior. And the third is pornography. In fact, I think all 3 of these are connected to pornography. All 3 of the factors that are connected to sexual violence are connected to pornography. The statistics on sexual violence are horrifying. 1 in 5 women are raped, making 22 million victims. 25% of college females experience a rape or an attempted rape in the 4 years they're at college. 50% of women will be sexually harassed on their jobs at some point in their lifetime. And by the time a female in the US is 18 years old, 38% have been sexually molested. 38% of our girls by the time they're 18. We have a sexual tsunami. And you don't solve these kinds of problems by pulling these victims out of the river one at a time. You have to go upstream and see who's pushing them in. In terms of rapists, the majority of rapists are repeat rapists. It's not done by 6 or 7 guys, but we find that most often it's done by men who are repeat rapists. In a college sample, of those who raped, 63% were repeat rapists, and in a military sample, those who raped, 71% were repeat rapists. But what about females? Women who are exposed to pornography as children are more likely to accept the rape myth, more likely to have sexual fantasies that involve rape. Women exposed as adults were more negative about their bodies, think that the male partners are more critical of their bodies, have reduced support for the women's liberation movement, just like their male counterparts, and also like their male counterparts think rapists deserve less time in prison. In my own research, I found that the young adult females who use pornography are more likely to be victims of non-consenting sex. Are the internet pornography sites making victims of our girls? Sexual obesity is a public health crisis. We have massive population exposure, and in some age groups it's approaching 100%. Massive impact on attitudes, behavior, marriage, sexual violence, and other crimes like prostitution. You can't protect yourself and you can't protect your family. In a world where the American Library Association had a website in which teens could click on a link to tell them how to disable the blocking software that their parents put on their home computers, you cannot protect your children. You can't protect your family from others who consume pornography because they become carriers of these attitudes and behaviors back to their homes, onto their jobs, into the street, into the schoolyard. We are unable to fix the problem on individual level. These companies who are making psychopaths out of our boys and victims out of our girls will not stop unless we stop them. Roger Scruton, a philosopher, put it in a more poetic way. He said, "Pornography threatens the loss of love in a world where only love brings happiness." If you eat the sexual junk food and become sexually abused, you'll miss the true feast. Love is the true feast. Don't miss the feast. Thank you.
Brian David Mitchell, my daughter's captor, grew up in a middle-class family. At a young age, he was exposed to pornography by his father. He told Elizabeth that his father loved pornography and had enjoyed it his entire life. Mitchell said that he loved it too. His father didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with a little healthy exposure for his son. At such a young age, it appeared to have piqued his interest, beginning the slippery slope that pushed him to take the next step to experiment. It resulted in a complaint filed against him for molestation of the girl next door. The juvenile court found him another troubled youth. He shared with Elizabeth that during his senior year in high school, he stuck his hand down the girl's shirt, that he was always excited to see what he could get away with. It was a challenge. The girl didn't report it, and he was never reprimanded. Pornography appeared to have encouraged further experimentation. The use of pornography followed him into his marriage. Accusations of abuse and pornography by his stepchildren and children made law enforcement comment that, well, this is all attributed to a bad divorce. Further investigation confirmed that such abuse had been made and was documented. What reconfirmed the issue of pornography was that his stepdaughter's testimony during the trial of our daughter's kidnapping. His stepdaughter testified that of him exposing her to pornography in bed. Was it just exposure, or was it another effort to normalize his behavior and desensitize his victims and make them feel that this is a normal activity of life, no harm done? His insatiable appetite for sex called for multiple partners, and of course his excuse became belabored with, "God wants me to experience all. You must experience the worst to enjoy the best." The night he abducted Elizabeth, he told her, "I have a knife at your throat. Don't say a word, or I will kill you and your family." Is this the end result of a little innocent exposure to pornography? Did this desire lead him to break into our home in the middle of the night when everyone was at home? Who would take such a risk and why? It seemed inconceivable to me. Elizabeth was a 14-year-old girl when she was kidnapped. During the time she was gone, she was repeatedly raped, molested, abused, tortured, terrified, threatened, tormented, lied to, cabled between two trees, withholding basic necessities of life, and forced to look at pornography as both an example of what he wanted and also a way to normalize his actions. She had to do many things against her will and beliefs. Elizabeth said she felt like dirt on the ground, broken and of little worth. It made her question her self-worth and how people would look at her and treat her. Who could love me after that? After thinking about it, she determined her family would, regardless of anyone else. She decided that she would do whatever was necessary to survive. Mitchell used many typical tactics of predators: vulnerability, manipulation, coercion, and grooming. During our family's 9-month ordeal, my wife Lois and I learned many things. Some of them we didn't particularly want to know, especially when it came to thinking about what our daughter was going through at that time. We learned that one of the main reasons children are abducted is for sexual exploitation. Whether that exploitation means the pleasure of one person, the exploitation of one person, or trafficked for multiple persons' exploitation. During her captivity, she was repeatedly exposed to pornography on a regular basis. She said he loved it and could not get enough. She recounted another experience while they were in California just outside Lakeside. As they were hiking up a mountainside trying to find a new camp, they came across a cave-like crevasse that might act as a shelter. He had Elizabeth crawl into it. As she got into it, she found a pornographic magazine and crawled right back out. Because of her concerned excitement, he wanted to know what was the problem. She told him that she'd found this pornographic magazine and she wanted out. She said he hurried back in there and brought it out. For days, he devoured it. The use of pornography appeared to have had profound effects upon Brian David Mitchell. The buildup of excitement from the viewing of this pornographic material put him on the prowl once again for his next victim. This greed and lust resulted in an unsuccessful attempt when he was almost caught and sent on an alcoholic binge to console his failure. Elizabeth has commented that many times she thought that one thing that would be worse than to be raped is the thought that it might be recorded on the virtual world for everyone to view. This has been confirmed by many survivors of abduction who have experienced the nightmare of not knowing where or when their picture video would pop up and further victimize them. Alicia Kozakavich, another outstanding survivor advocate, and I quote Alicia, "Before the trial, the FBI needed me to identify myself in the videos. I had to watch myself being tortured. Being abused is indescribable, but to see it through the eyes of your abuser is another thing entirely. That's why I now fight so hard against child exploitation. I know how it feels to have people watch your suffering and enjoy it." Families are torn apart by pornography, which has become unfortunately too far common, especially with the use of their own children as this new pornography. Two crimes are then being committed. The one that the child is being raped, and secondly, the posting of it on the internet. One of my other good friends came home to find an FBI group besieging her home. Unaware of the abuse her daughter had been put through by her father, he would then post it on the internet, leaving it an almost eternal trail of sexual exploitation. The devastation and destruction of the family is unbelievable. Being in charge of prevention and rehabilitation at Underground Railroad has given me a unique opportunity of hearing about the use of pornography and trafficking on a global basis. It is such an integral part of trafficking being used from both the supply and the demand sides. Many of our operation missions occur under the disguise of being a sex party focusing on the youngest of children, or virgins if possible. We had a number of missions down in Colombia this past year, and we had 5 of our partners come up and join us in Salt Lake 2 weeks ago. 2 of them were women that deal with children. Part of their job is to conduct the prosecutorial interviews and assessments to collect information. I asked them, what role does pornography play from the pimp's trafficked victims? She said, it comes up as having been viewed by all the children in every case. Once again, using it to instruct the kids on what to do for their clients and also to desensitize the children so that the children aren't traumatized by what is forced upon them. Pornography drives the demand side to experiment further. No longer are they satisfied with just looking, but experiencing what they have seen. Operation Underground Railroad is currently furthering the development of software used to track those who trade child pornography. The commonality of all of these is that pornography provides a slippery slope to take the next step to abuse and exploitation. Thank you.
The solutions are tough, but I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about policy. I know there are a lot of congressional staffers in this room, and we believe that this is an issue that cries out for leadership. Simply put, as Dawn mentioned, I've spent the past 30 years of my life focusing on the protection of children. And I believe there's a simple, basic message that all of us need to understand. And that is the developing brains of younger and younger children are being bombarded with extreme, graphic, dehumanizing pornographic images. Let me just quickly capsulize what I think we know from the research, much of which you've heard today. The consensus is that the average age of first exposure to this content is 12. And there's research that indicates, as you saw Clay's research earlier, that younger and younger children are accessing this content. The latest estimate is that fully a third of 10-year-olds are accessing and seeing this kind of content on the internet. 53% of 12 to 15-year-old boys are accessing internet pornography. 28% of 12 to 15-year-old girls. The other message I hope you heard from Gail Dines is that porn has changed with the internet. Soft porn has disappeared, and it has been replaced with extreme content that is not only graphic and in many cases violent, but also degrading, dehumanizing, changing the way children view people of the other sex. There's also been, as Gail mentioned, a fundamental change in the industry with the explosion of free pornography as a gateway to the commercial child pornography industry. Gail mentioned MindGeek, the Luxembourg company that has become the Walmart for free porn in the world today, with apologies to Walmart. What we have learned, New York Magazine did an article a couple of years ago that indicated 10 years ago there were 1 million unique visitors per day to pornography on the internet. Today, there are 42 million unique visitors per day just to the so-called tube sites, the pornography sites patterned off of YouTube, in which you can access for free graphic pornography. 42 million unique visitors per day. The internet has also changed the way that we address this problem and has created far greater vulnerability and risk for kids. The internet is no longer tethered to a desk or a table in the family room at home. It is being carried around in the hands of millions of people and increasingly millions of children. Cisco just released a report that indicated that their estimate is that mobile volume will increase 11-fold by the year 2018. And much of that volume is in the hands of our children who are carrying mobile devices around. 30 years ago, I was a public official in a local government. What we could do 30 years ago was zone it off. We could deny accidental access to the public by requiring the institutions to cover their windows. We could put plain brown wrappers over the content. We could deny, as a matter of law, access to children. We can't do that anymore in this era of the internet. So why is finding a solution so difficult? And what are the challenges that you as a Congress and we as an American public face? Well, I submit that there are three primary reasons why finding a solution has become so difficult. One is the efforts of Congress to address this problem by law have failed. In the 1990s, Congress passed 3 pieces of legislation designed to address this problem: the Communications Decency Act, the Child Online Protection Act, and the Children's Internet Pornography Act. In all 3 cases, most of the elements that address this problem have been struck down by the courts as an unconstitutional intrusion on free speech. Second issue, efforts to educate parents have failed. Now, not entirely. Internet companies have spent millions of dollars. Heroic NGOs have done incredible work, but a recent survey indicated that just 28% of parents use the free filtering tools and access controls that are available, and only 17% are using those tools on mobile devices where their children are accessing this content. And finally, the third issue, the third factor, is that obscenity prosecutions have disappeared. The kind of content that we're talking about today is not protected speech. I'm a lawyer. I believe in free speech. I believe in as free and unfettered an internet as possible. But this content's not protected under the First Amendment or anything else. But in order to address it, you have to have an adjudication that is obscene. And one of the key reasons why obscenity cases are no longer being brought is that one of the 3 criteria laid down by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1973, one of them is a community standards test. And the question is, how do you establish community standards in this era of the internet, where there is a global community? And as a result, and I think it's a bad decision, but as a result, fewer and fewer prosecutors are willing to bring these cases. So what are the options? Don't ask me to be positive, and I'll try to be positive. What are the options? Well, I think there is a very compelling option that we need to think about, and that option is called default filtering. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, made an extraordinary speech in July of 2013 when she talked about this issue. And he said it is very difficult for politicians to talk about this. And it's very difficult for the public to talk about it. So Prime Minister Cameron called it corroding childhood. He said we are changing the childhood of millions of people for the worse, and it will have long-range implications. And so he challenged the 4 major British ISPs to create default filtering. Interesting approach, because it doesn't deal with this issue as a free speech issue. If you want content, you want access to the content, you can still get it. But routinely, working through these British ISPs, access to the content will be automatically filtered unless you as the account holder decide to turn it off. In January of 2015, January of this year, Sky Broadband in the United Kingdom created and implemented a shield filter for their 5.3 million users. TalkTalk, a second major British ISP, has implemented it. British Telecom is surveying all of their users across the United Kingdom to determine if they want to use it. So, in full candor, I also want to make the point to you that this is not necessarily a popular action. And the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is receiving enormous feedback from lots of critics including the European Union. The Council of the European Union has just adopted a provision that it will take to the European Parliament this fall that will prohibit filtering any content of this type from ISPs and sites. Now, I don't think that will pass, but out of that model, I think there may be a solution. There may be a way forward. And keep in mind, in the United Kingdom, it did not require legislation. It was a challenge by the leader of that country to the internet companies in that country to become aware of the risks, become aware of the damage that's being done to a whole generation. Gail said it and Cordelia said it earlier. Some of the leading researchers in the world have said we are in the midst of the single largest unregulated social experiment in human history. And the price we're going to pay for it is enormous. So my challenge to you, who represent members of Congress, and those of you who represent other kinds of groups and organizations, is it's time to act. We can do something about this, and it does not necessarily require legislation, though legislation would be great. But it's time to act, and we can change the future for millions of families and millions of children. Thank you very much.